Good afternoon, everyone. This is Hadi Mubarak. So today we'll be discussing the historical context of the debate on gender in Islam and looking specifically at the way it was intertwined with the history of colonialism in the Muslim world. When we speak of the term feminism, one thing we need to recognize is that terms have a history and that the term feminism has a unique history in the West that is different than its history in the Muslim world. The term feminism emerges first in France in the late 1880s by Hubertine Auclair, who was advocating for women's suffrage rights and other political rights that she believed were not delivered by the French Revolution. Later on, this term appears in English in the UK in the early 20th century and about a decade later in the United States. However, in the Muslim world, its encounter with feminism is deeply intertwined with its encounter with colonialism in specific. And we'll see why, as Layla Ahmed describes this in her work. So as we discuss gender in Islam, one thing we need to recognize again is that there is a history to the Muslim world's encounter with specifically Western rhetoric on gender in Islam. And this is deeply intertwined with the history of colonialism. Our readings for this week focused on the British occupation of Egypt, which occurred between 1882 and 1914, as well as the second reading by Julia Clancy Smith focused on the French occupation of Algeria between 1830 to 1962. However, we also should recognize that the British and French, as well as the Italians, also colonized other parts of the Muslim world. Obviously, British India, which later on in 1947 breaks apart and becomes partly Pakistan, and then later also Bangladesh. The French had also occupied Syria and Lebanon. The British had occupied Iraq and Jordan. And obviously, there was a British Mandate of Palestine. And so another country missing from our readings was Tunisia, also occupied by the French. So we need to, while our readings focus on these two countries, we just should be aware of the fact that there is this larger context. And so to move on, the reason Layla Ahmed calls the colonialist rhetoric on feminism as an appropriation is because she believes it was strategically used to legitimate the colonial project. And so that she doesn't believe that the colonial administrators were these real feminists who were concerned with women's rights in the Muslim world, but rather they really wanted to morally justify colonialism in these parts of the world. The problem, she argues, with the colonial rhetoric on Islam is that it viewed Islam itself as inherently problematic, and that it was basically, in the words of Lord Cromer himself, the colonial British consul in Egypt, was that Islam was the fatal obstacle to women's progress. And therefore, in order for Muslim women to move forward, they needed to abandon native religious practices. And so if Muslim women needed to abandon native religious practices, how do they move forward? How do they progress? In the perspective or in the viewpoint of the colonialists, the way they moved forward was by specifically looking to the West as their model in their path for reform. And this is a picture here of Lord Cromer, and he talks about, in his words, this baneful effect on Eastern society, which again is the effect of Islam on women. And so according to our author, Layla Ahmed, he says, he argues that the natives should be forced to abandon their backward ways and instead imbibe, in his words, the true spirit of Western civilization, primarily by changing the position of women in their society. This is a quote by Layla Ahmed: "The idea that other men in colonized societies or societies beyond the borders of the civilized West oppressed women was to be used in the rhetoric of colonialism to render morally justifiable its project of undermining or eradicating the cultures of colonized people." So why does Layla Ahmed call this an appropriation? It's because she says that when we look at the history actually of these men, such as Lord Cromer, another one was Curzon, they actually opposed women's suffrage in their own native countries. For Lord Cromer and Curzon, Lord Cromer again was a British consul in Egypt. He actually was a founding member and at some point president of the Men's League for opposing women's suffrage in England. And in fact, the anti-suffrage movement was sometimes called the Curzon-Cromer movement, named after Lord Cromer, who again was, in a sense, really just giving lip service to the issue of women's rights in the Muslim world. Layla Ahmed argues that both Western feminists and Christian missionaries who were well-meaning actually also adopted the same type of rhetoric as colonialists who framed progress for Muslim women in the sense of abandoning religious practices. And there was a great distortion between Islam itself and Muslim practices. And so this was also the mistake that Lord Cromer did. He did not distinguish between Islam as a tradition of, again, currently today, there's been in the Islamic calendar, we're in the year 1438. So what they saw in Egypt at the time in the early 20th century was taken to be Islam itself. And so there was no distinction being made between what Muslims were doing and what the tradition actually teaches. Again, there were well-meaning Western feminists in Egypt at the time, such as Eugene Le Brun, and who actually was a mentor for Huda al-Sha'rawi, who becomes one of Egypt's first feminists. And Layla Ahmed argues, and again, Layla Ahmed is not someone who who covers her hair or is even a practicing Muslim by any means. In fact, she's has a very secular orientation. Yet, as a historian, she recognizes that the British in specific and Western feminists imbibed a certain meaning to the head cover and to the veil in general. And so Huda al-Sha'rawi, again, which was one of Egypt's first feminists, staged this public removal of the veil, and later in her memoir, she talks about how Eugene Le Brun actually had encouraged her to really focus on the veil as a priority for Muslim women in Egypt. The reason this discussion is important is because this history of colonialism and the way it appropriates feminist rhetoric in a very, I guess you can say, disingenuous way, creates a backlash. And it creates a backlash in different ways. Obviously, in the current contemporary period, it creates a backlash in that a lot of people in the Muslim world until this day are very defensive when it comes to Western intervention, specifically in women's rights. At the time, however, in the early 20th century, there are three different types of responses that emerge. One is indigenous responses that internalize colonial rhetoric, such as that of Qasim Amin, who very ironically was called the father of Arab feminism. However, he internalized a lot of what the colonialists were saying, arguing that Muslims were inherently inferior and really should look to Western practices and try to emulate the West in sort of a blind way, right? Whereas Muslim modernists like Muhammad Abdo also believed that Muslims should adopt Western practices that were really compatible and consistent with modernity and progress, but in a way that wasn't sort of reneging on the principles of Islam. And so he tried to find this sort of fusion between Islam and modernity, if you will. And he also argued that abuses against women did not stem from Islam, but actually stemmed from the ignorance of Muslims themselves. Islamists actually emerged later on around the 1920s, and they took a more defensive position. And they basically try to reverse this inferiority complex, saying that Islam actually gives women dignity and whatnot. And so in the next two slides you will see quotations of that. Layla Ahmed also demonstrates that in the 20th century, two strains of feminism emerged in the Arab world, one that was rooted in a native vernacular Islamic discourse, and one that valorized Western ways as more advanced and more civilized than native ways. And she argues that the second strain of feminism becomes a more dominant one. In this chapter that we read this week by Layla Ahmed on the discourse of the veil, she's really interested in examining the way this colonial rhetoric on women in Islam influences the way Muslim societies begin to perceive the headscarf. She also argues that eventually the Muslim world comes to at least the modernizing elites, I should say, the modernizing elites, the secular elites, some of the newly formed governments in some parts of the Muslim world come to reject the hijab. They view it as regressive, as backwards, as basically a symbol of inferiority in comparison to the West. And she argues that this perception in specific vis-a-vis the headscarf is a direct product of Western colonialism as well as Western feminism. That the Western colonial rhetoric really prioritizes removing the veil as a symbol of that the veil itself was a symbol of Muslim backwardness. And she also demonstrates the way well-meaning Western feminists like Eugene Lebrun, who, as I demonstrated in one of my earlier slides, was a mentor to Huda al-Sha'rawi, one of the first Arab feminists. And she also prioritizes removing the headscarf as an impediment to women's rights. And so Layla Ahmed, the author we read this week, is arguing that this prioritization of removing the headscarf doesn't come from Muslim women themselves. It comes from outside of the Muslim world. And this is important for us to understand because it demonstrates why this becomes a very complicated issue and why in the first half of the 20th century, really up till the late 1970s, most of the upper classes in the Muslim world end up rejecting the headscarf because they are internalizing this view, if you will, that comes from the early 20th century. But later on, there's a pushback to this, and the following slides from Cairo, the graduating classes of Cairo University, will basically demonstrate how this push to unveil sort of reverses itself, with many Muslims reclaiming what they believe is their, authentic heritage, and it sort of comes as a pushback to the effects of Western colonialism. And so it's important for us to understand just how this issue and this symbol, if you will, becomes very complicated by the history of colonialism. What we find is that the colonial rhetoric on women in Islam was internalized by modernizing elites as well as basically the new governments that were formed post-colonialism. So, for example, we have here 3 examples of countries that either completely banned the headscarf or at least partially abandoned it. In Turkey, it was at least partially banned from certain institutions. Women could not attend any public university or any public institution wearing a headscarf until very, very recently. In fact, this has been the case, which is quite ironic for a country that is a democracy, that women, in fact, who wanted to seek higher education and continue to wear the headscarf would either, wear a wig or be forced to remove it when they attended college, or and I've heard of several stories of women not attending college at all because they did not want to forsake this practice that they believe is a God-mandated practice. In Iran, what's interesting is, and very ironic, is that he actually also banned the veil in the 1920s. So what we find is that extremism begets extremism. And so it's the very country, one of the 2 countries that enforce the hijab today are Iran and Saudi Arabia. These are the 2 countries that require women by law to cover. And it's interesting that it is this very country, Iran, that requires women to cover, is the same country that had actually banned women from covering in its early history. So this is a very important point I often emphasize to students, is that, when you have one form of extremism, the pendulum tends to move the other way and create another form of extremism. Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia was also very notorious for having not just banned the hijab from state offices, but also really sort of tried to ban many religious practices, including even fasting the month of Ramadan, which, as you all learned at the very beginning of the semester, is a pillar, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and has been practiced, since the very beginning of Islam in the 7th century. Yet he actually tried to ban the fasting of Ramadan and argued that it was created an unproductive economy. The reason this is important is also for us to realize that the modernizing, a lot of the heads of state, a lot of the new governments that were formed were ones that continued the rhetoric that was employed by colonialists early on in the 20th century. But I have these pictures, a Cairo University graduating class of 1959, where you can see here there are very few women wearing the headscarf. And then if you move forward, 1978, also, maybe not a single woman is wearing the headscarf. And this is definitely true of the first half of the 20th century. However, if you move forward to 1995 and 2004, you can see the stark difference. And so the question is, why after, rejecting the headscarf and removing the headscarf for several decades, do Muslim women start wearing it again? And it's really impossible to understand this phenomena without looking at the history of the Muslim world in the last century and a half, and specifically looking at the history of colonialism, the way it appropriated gender issues to legitimate the colonial project, and then the way also it focused on the veil as an impediment to women's rights. And so a lot of women, by sort of reclaiming the headscarf, are rejecting this idea that the West or colonialists or whoever it may be will dictate to Muslim women what their priorities should be. And they believe that they themselves should dictate or determine what the priorities should be for Muslim women. And this is connected to the rise of Islamic feminism, which we'll discuss in our next topic.